So the next topic in this Unit A is decimals and percents. So we just did fractions, which are often ways of representing parts of a whole. Decimals and percents also help us represent parts of a whole. So that's kind of the thread that ties this together. You have already handled decimals and percents at different times in your life. So again, it's a bit of a review, kind of collecting people up with some of these math or arithmetic skills as we move from arithmetic into algebra and kind of the foundational pieces that'll hopefully get us going. So writing a fraction as a decimal, the fraction line can be thought of as division. So when it's 1 over 2, that could be 1 divided by 2. If you put that into your calculator, you're quite likely going to know that it would read 0.5. So again, always coming up with an example that is intuitive, something that you already know. Awesome. The other thing you can do is you could do it long division style, right? So I think people tend to use their calculators. I'm going to give us one example of long division. Mostly because people kind of forget where things go. So when this is 5/8, it could also be read as 5 divided by 8. So doing long division style, it's 5 divided by 8. So quick recap, if long division is one of your nemesis, if you're like, breaking out in hives right now thinking about long division, I honestly have to say when I make videos, I kind of do. Definitely math anxiety over it. So long division would say we have to put the decimal here and 0 so we can move over. I would say how many times does 8 go into not 5 because it can't. I've bumped over to 50 and I would guess that it would go 6 times. Multiplying that down would be 48. We don't want to go over the 50, right? Because then we subtract to get our remainder. Bring down another 0. And so ask yourself, how many times does 8 go into 20 without going over? Well, 2, and that would give me 16 when I multiply it down. Subtracting that would give me a 4. Just as a reminder, this is optional. You can use your calculator, so tune me out if you need to. Bringing down another 0, I now ask myself, how many times does 8 go into 40? Goes 5 times. And I've got no remainder here. So I've got a nice even number, an even decimal that ends. If you want, you can plug in 5 divided by 8 on your calculator and have been done at least 45 seconds ago. If I were to do this one on my calculator, I'm going to spare you the long division. If you really want to sharpen those skills, really remember long division, you absolutely can. 0.875 is what I get on my calculator. Remembering the order that it's 7 divided by 8. When I see a fraction, it's a part of a whole. A decimal is also a part of a whole, and these have the same value. So sometimes when you have a decimal, you're asked to round to a specific decimal place. And just as a reminder of those decimal places, we have tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So many consonants at the end there. It's a really bit awkward. And as a reminder, there is no oneths. I don't even know how you'd spell oneths. It just doesn't exist. It's not a word and it's not a concept in math. The first decimal place is the tenths. So with rounding rules, and again, big review, so maybe you've done this, you don't need to know it. The rounding rules are you look at where you want to stop the number and then consider the next digit over. If the next number is 5 or more, you're going to round up. And if it's less than 5, you leave it alone. So if it's 4 or smaller, you don't change the number that you're going to end your number at. So we're going to practice these ones. We could write as a decimal. If you want to do long division, you sure can, but I think I'm going to use a calculator. So 3 divided by 7 in my calculator gives me something like this, 0.42857, blah, blah, blah. Handy tip, if you are still using a phone calculator right now, I would highly recommend getting a real calculator. They're just much more user-friendly. And if you turn your phone landscape, you get a bigger display. It'll also switch it into scientific mode, which might be useful. But honestly, better than using your phone is getting a real scientific calculator. Doesn't have to be fancy. About $11 would do it. And so, yeah, maybe think about it. So we've got a decimal. This is what my calculator said. It actually went on, I think. We're going to round it to the nearest thousandths. So that would be after the third decimal there. So we want to round there. So in order for my number to stop there, I take a look at the next number over and then make a decision based on that. Because it's a 5, that means I'm going to bump my 8 up to a 9. And so that decimal would be that fraction represented to 3 decimal places. It's not an exact value, but for whatever your math purposes might be, that would probably be enough. So next one, 5 divided by 12, do it on your calculator and then round to 3 decimal places. So 0.417 would be that value written as a decimal and rounded. So you may have noticed in that last one that the 6 went on and on and on forever. There is a very common occurrence of repeats when you do fractions into decimals. So these next ones, when you put them into your calculator, they're all going to have a repeat. So if we don't want to round them and approximate the decimal, there is a way of representing an exact value with bar notation. So basically, you put a bar over top of what's repeating. And so that would be 5/11ths, not rounded this time as an exact value because we've used the bar notation over the component of the decimal that repeats itself on and on forever. Next one, if I put it in my calculator, and you might know these, that's going to be 0.3 on forever. And so rather than rounding, I'd say it's 0.3. And sometimes it was a dot or a bar, either one, is a way of representing that digit goes on in repeat forever. There are really, really long repeats out there. And yeah, this is a long one. So put it in your calculator. Definitely an advantage to have a long display on your calculator. So a real calculator. In a pinch, your phone turns sideways. Watch for this long repeat. It's not the longest in math. There's really, really long repeats. But that would be 5/7 written out as a decimal without rounding, but representing a repeat. So playing around, kind of switching from one form to another, we started out with fractions in the first section of Unit A. Now we're kind of going between fractions and decimals. So let's go back from decimals to fractions. So if we were given a decimal, it is possible to represent that as a fraction. Illustrating these up here, not reading them to you, what we're going to do is write down the digit that we see. So I see an 8 as our numerator. The denominator is going to be a 1, and then as many zeros as there are decimal places in the number. So I see 1 decimal place, so there'd be 1 0 there. So 8/10 is the way of representing that as a fraction, but it's not in lowest terms. Remembering that is a sticking point in this course. We want to always reduce our fractions to lowest terms. The other thing you can do is you could always check with a calculator, right? You could put 4 divided by 5 in your calculator, should be able to go back to the original question. So another one here really illustrating this process. I see the digits 257. That's going to be my numerator. I put down a 1 and then I follow with as many zeros as there are places in my decimal. So I see 3 places in my decimal, and so it'd be over 1,000. You could take a long time with this one to figure out if 257 is a prime number or if it shares a factor with 1,000. I'm going to speed us up and just tell you we're good. because those are big, ugly, really awful numbers. So the next one here, I'll talk through it and then I'll put the answer up for the last one. I see the digit of 4. That's my numerator. I'm going to put it over the denominator with a 1 and as many decimal places as I can see. This is 4 1,000ths. So again, both are even numbers dividing by 2. I'd get 2 over 50. Whoops, I could have divided by 4, I guess. So dividing by 2 again, I get 1 over 25 as a fraction in lowest terms. This one you might recognize and just know that 0.25 is a quarter, but if I follow the process that I've been explaining, you could do it this way as well. And again, in this course, it doesn't matter how you get there, it's really a functional understanding that we're looking for. And I'll give you as many tools. It's nice to have a process that will always work, but I don't think we're as rigid as to, really get in the way. If somebody understands something in their own way, then you're good. So do make sure you're always reducing when you do that. So we did fractions and decimals are both parts of a whole, and now we're going to do the last one, which are percents. Honestly, percentages we deal with mostly with tax, or let's hope interest rates, or maybe rates of return on investments. You might also think of percentages as they relate to grades, right? So if you get 14%, not on a test in this course, but 14% on something. Let's say 14% return on an investment. That'd be awesome. That means you get 14 out of 100 on a test, right? Or $14 on $100 as an investment, right? Again, with this one, we're going to have to reduce it. The key thing in this is that you're going to replace the percent with 100 as the denominator, right? And so reducing, I'll divide both by 2, and I get 7 over 50. So 35% is really 35 over 100. Reducing to lowest terms, I get 7 over 20. And the last one, 10 out of 100 would be 1/10. One-tenth you might think of as 0.1. The last thing we're going to do is kind of complete the circle here, right? So I find that often this gets like one thing at a time is fine, but doing them all together. So coming up with an example that makes sense of you kind of going from one to another, right? So fractions, decimals, and percentages, and being comfortable moving back and forth between them can be really useful. So rather than writing out rules, say on your formula sheets, come up with an example. So just bringing it back to something you know that 1/2 is 0.5, and you know that that's 50%, right? You've got these skills. You know how to do it as a fraction, as a decimal, and as a percentage. So don't get flustered with the mathiness of all these other questions, because you understand the mechanics on a simple example. So maybe that's way more powerful for you than writing out instructions on how to do this. So taking that, if we wanted to go from a percentage to a decimal, what we're going to do is take, and you're dividing by 100, or you're moving the decimal place to the left. So the decimal place in 25 is here. If I wanted to represent this as a decimal, I'd move it over to there. So 0.25 is 25% as a decimal. Take a look back at your 0.5 was 50%, right? You know this stuff already. So in these ones, we're moving the decimal place over. 4.5% is 0.045 as a decimal. Here, same thing on all of them, quite repetitive. We've got 1.3 is 130% as a decimal. And this one, I did it in the notes. I went the wrong way and I'm like, oh, it's 0.3. Awesome. No, it's not. You've got to move it the same way, right? So this is a good example of getting flustered or confused when the questions get weirder. So that would be 0.003% as a decimal. Other way around, so a decimal as a percent, you're really going to move the decimal place right and attach the percent symbol. So basically you're multiplying it by 100 to write it as a percent. It's the reverse of what you just did. So multiplying something by 100 is going to take and move the decimal place that way to the right. So it's here to start. We're going to go boom, boom. 0.18 is 18%. 0.03 is 3%. Easy to do these when they're all in a row, but when they get muddled up or mixed, it's a little bit trickier to remember. 0.27 is 27%. Last one, if you can kind of roll it all together and do think back to the 0.5, these ones, what we want to do is the whole meal deal. So say you get 3 out of 5 on a quiz. What is that percent? And so you have to kind of move from fraction to decimal to percent to do these last ones, kind of puts it all together. So I use my calculator and I'd say, okay, this fraction as a decimal, it would be 3 divided by 5, right, is 0.6 on my calculator. That's that fraction as a decimal. Now to write it as a percent, I'd move the decimal place over, right, multiply by 100. It is 60% of a whole, or 60% on the test, right? All of these ones, that's how I'm doing it. I'd write it as a decimal. And then it does say here, round to the nearest whole number for the percent, right? So I'm going to round this to 33%. It would be 33, 0.3 repeating percent, but I've been given different instructions here. So I'm just following those. This one on my calculator is 0.375. So multiplying it by 100 and rounding it, two separate things, right, gives me 38%. I'll write the last ones without saying so much. And the last one, rounding to the nearest percentage gives me the final answer. So do some practice on those ones. Put something on your formula sheets to keep you straight on them. I don't think it's difficult mechanics, but sometimes you get flustered and go the wrong way or something like that. So do something to keep yourself clear on this other way of representing parts of a whole.